Chapter 5, Review B. If you take a look at the picture, point A is a midpoint, point B is a midpoint, point C is a midpoint. So AC is a midsegment, it's parallel to the opposite side. AB is a midsegment, it's parallel to that third side. CB is a midsegment, it's parallel to that third side. So we're just going to go through the list. They're looking for what it's parallel to. MN is parallel to segment CB. ON is parallel to the midsegment CA. AB is the midsegment, it's parallel to MO, the third side. CB is a midsegment, so it's parallel to that third side, MN. OM is the third side, it's parallel to the midsegment, AB. And AC is a midsegment, it's parallel to that third side, ON. Since J, K, and L are all midpoints, that means that LK, JK, and JL are all midsegments. Midsegments are equal to half of the third side which it's parallel to. Since a midpoint cuts a side in half, where this 12 is, each side would be 6, and the midsegment would also be 6, the one that it's parallel to. Where this is 20, it would cut it in half. Each one of these pieces would then be 10, and the one that it's parallel to, the midsegment, would also be 10. Since this whole thing is 14, it would cut it in half. Each one of these would be 7, and the midsegment would also be 7. So from Y to K. From Y to K, 10. From J to K, 7. From L to K, 6. From J to L, 10. From Y to L, 7. And from K to L, 6. The 2x plus 1 is a midsegment. A midsegment is equal to half of the base. We don't typically like to take half of something, especially like this. So it's much easier to say it takes 2 of these midsegments to be equal to the base. So I have 2 times 2x plus 1 is equal to 18. And I'm going to distribute the 2 through the parentheses. 4x plus 2 is equal to 18. Subtracting 2, 4x is equal to 16. Dividing by 4, x is equal to 4. Come over to the other problem. I can see that the 3x is a midsegment because it's connecting the midpoints. The midsegment, it takes 2 of them to be equal to the side that it's parallel to, 21. So I have 6x is equal to 21. I would divide both sides by 6. Although it's okay to leave things improper, I should really simplify them. These are both divisible by 3. Would give me 7 over 2. This is an okay answer. You could have written 3.5. This would also be okay. And you could have changed it into a decimal, 3.5. Point of concurrency of the angle bisectors. The easiest thing to do is trace out the angle bisector. LW bisects this angle. JY bisects this angle. And their point of concurrency is where they meet, which is X. CX bisects, or OX bisects this angle, NB bisects this angle, and their point of intersection is Z. This is an application of the Hinge theorem. It's actually the converse. And the first thing we're going to do is look how we're going to compare these numbers. 3x minus 15, we are going to compare to 66. I can see that I have two sides of a triangle that are congruent, and the third side is different. So the angles that are across from the third side would also be different. The other part of this inequality comes from the fact that any angle, 3x minus 15, has to be bigger than 0, but it has to be less than 180 degrees. And we determine which part of this we use after we get this set up. 66 is across from 25. 25 is bigger than 23, so the 66 is bigger than the 3x minus 15. Since I compared 3x minus 15 being less than something, that eliminates this part of the inequality. I want to compare 3x minus 15 being greater than 0. And I'm simply going to solve these two inequalities. I'm going to add 15 to both sides. I now have 3x is less than 81, and I divide both sides by 3. So x is less than 27. I'm going to add 15 to both sides. I have 3x is greater than 15. When I divide both sides by 3, I get x is greater than 5. So I know x has to be larger than 5, but it has to be smaller than 27. There's my range. I do the same thing on this next problem. I noticed that I had two sides marked as congruent. This side is reflexive. The third side is different. So the angles that are across from the third side are also going to be different. 2x minus 4 is going to get compared to 28. 2x minus 4 could be compared to 0, but it could be compared to 180. And we determine which one we're going to compare it to after we set this one up. Since 50 is larger than 48, the 28 is going to be larger than the 2x minus 4. Since 2x minus 4 is already less than something, I've used the less than portion, so I'm now going to use the greater than portion. And I'm going to solve these two inequalities. I'm going to add 4 to both sides. 2x is less than 32, and I'm going to divide both sides by 2. X is less than 16. Adding 4 to both sides in the second inequality, 2x is greater than 4. Dividing both sides by 2, x is greater than 2. Writing it into one inequality, x has to be bigger than 2, and x has to be less than 16. Remember that when you're working with a centroid, that if you said that this point was a centroid, the distance from the side to the centroid would be x. The distance from the centroid to the vertex would be twice as big, and that means that the whole thing would be 3x. Everything can be set up with this concept. So if I took it number 19, it says dz equals 12. From d all the way to z is 12. The whole segment is 12. In other words, the whole thing, dz, the 3x portion of my problem, is equal to 12. And I would divide both pieces by 3, which means x is 4. The x portion is the portion that's attached to the side. So from A to D is going to be that 4 portion. And from A to Z is twice as big. 4 times 2 is 8. So from Z to A is 8. And that answers both pieces. ZA is 8, AD is 4. AB is 6, and I'm going to put that in my picture. Notice the AB is attached to the side. It is technically the X portion. AB is 6, it's the X portion, and X is 6, which means that 2X, twice of 6, is going to be 12, which means AY equals 12. And when I add both pieces together, the whole thing would be equal to 18, which means BY is 18. In the last section, AC is 3. AC is attached to the side. It's the X portion. X is 3, which means 2X is equal to 6, which means AX in this case is 6. And if I add both pieces together, the whole thing would be 9. From C to X would be a total of 9 units long. You absolutely need to know your definitions. A median is connected from a vertex to a midpoint of the opposite side. An altitude is connected from the midpoint perpendicular to a line containing the opposite side. MN is a median, and it's a median because it connects the vertex to the midpoint. M is the vertex, it's the point of the triangle, and it's connected to N, it's the midpoint. I can tell it's a midpoint because it created 2 equal parts. And M is an altitude. I can tell that it's an altitude because N is the vertex. And line NM is perpendicular to the opposite side. And I can tell it's perpendicular because they show that 90-degree angle. So NM is an altitude. Again, vocabulary important. You need to be able to not only describe what a median or an altitude is, but you need to be able to identify them in a picture. A median comes from a vertex, so it could be SB, it could be UA, but it has to be connected to the midpoint. So SB is the median in this picture. An altitude has to come from a vertex and has to be perpendicular. So since it comes from a vertex, UA or SB, but it has to be perpendicular, so UA is the altitude. The orthocenter is the point of concurrency of my altitudes. So if I look at the altitudes, segment AH is an altitude, segment BE is an altitude, and the point that they had in common was H. Segment WY is an altitude, segment TX is an altitude, and the point that they had in common was Y. If I'm going to list the angles in order from smallest to largest, I need to decide what sides are the smallest. And I'm just going to go around this one and label them small, medium, and large. If I start with X and I take 3 away from it, this is obviously smaller than X if I'm 3 less. So right now this is large, this is small. If I take away 5, it would get smaller yet. So the smallest side is x minus 5. The one that's in the middle would be here. And the largest side would be where the x is at. So the smallest angle is going to be across from the smallest side. Angle E would be the smallest. The one that's in the middle is going to be across from the x minus 3, angle D. And then the largest is going to be angle F because it's across from the x. I do the same thing in this particular problem. The smallest angle is going to be across from the smallest side, which is 13y, angle G. The next smallest side would be 14y, angle I is across from it. And the largest side would be across from the 21y, which is angle H. This is kind of the reverse of what we did up here. Here they're asking me to list the sides in order from shortest to longest. The shortest side is going to be across from the smallest angle. This will be the shortest because 40 is less than any of the other angles. 50 is next in line, so this would be in the middle. And this would be the largest. So the smallest side, segment PQ. The middle size, segment QR. And the largest, segment PR. When I come over to do number 31, the first thing I got to do is find this missing piece. I would add these two angles together. 54 and 56 is a total of 110. There is 180 degrees in a triangle. It means that the angle that's remaining is 70. The smallest side will be across from the smallest angle. This would be the smallest. The middle one is going to be across from the 56. And the largest is going to be across from the 70. So from smallest to largest, it would go segment UV. The middle would be segment UW. And the largest would be segment WV. If you're explaining whether these can make a triangle, the sum of two sides must be greater than the third side. So I take the two smallest sides, I use their sum, 10 plus 13, and see if it's greater than the third side, 18. 21 is bigger than 18, so yes, this would make a triangle. And this technically is my explanation. If I take my shortest two sides, 6 plus 5, I check to see if it's greater than 12. Well, 11 in fact isn't greater than 12. 11 is less than 12. So this won't make a triangle, and again, technically, this work is how I would take the time to explain it. If you wanted to explain it in words, you would say the sum of two sides is greater than the third side. In this problem, you'd say the sum of two sides is not greater than the third side. When you're finding the range of the third side of a triangle, you simply compare. You find out what it's bigger than by subtracting the two numbers. And you find out what it's less than by adding the two numbers. So x has to be greater than 8 minus 4. X has to be less than 8 plus 4. So x is greater than 4, but it's less than 12. Same thing here. X has got to be greater than 13 minus 8, but x has to be less than 13 plus 8. 13 minus 8 is 5. 13 plus 8 is 21. So x has to be larger than 5, but smaller than 21. 36 and 37. They're asking me to compare or write an inequality of AB and CB. So they're comparing these two sides in this problem. I see I have one side marked as congruent. The other side would be congruent is this side that's reflexive. In order to compare AB to CB, I'd have to know something about this angle that's in here. But I do know that these two form a linear pair. A linear pair adds up to 180. 100 of it is on one side. That means 80 of it is on the other. Whatever is across from the 100 degrees must be larger than what is across from the 80. So therefore, AB is smaller than CB. AB is less than CB. You could also write it this way: CB must be greater than AB. I look to see where my two sides are congruent. In this one, I have 9 and 9. I have 10.5 and 10.5. Now I'm looking at comparing the angles, so I look at the third side. When I'm looking at the third side, whatever is across from 12 has got to be greater than what's across from 11. So the measure of angle U must be less than the measure of angle X, or I could say that the measure of angle X is going to be greater than the measure of angle U. Be sure that you take time to study your vocabulary. The vocabulary is the key to this section. You need to be able to define it. You need to be able to identify it. And a lot of times through identifying it, like centroid, it tells you what the relationship is between segments.